Hello, I'm Nathan, the creator of Growing the Grove, a strategic card game based on growing sacred forests and Ogham. Ogham, sometimes pronounced Ogham, is an ancient Celtic writing system, usually cut off of vertical lines in stones or wooden posts, where each symbol corresponds to a different letter or sound. Those symbols also have correspondences to certain plants and meanings in divination and magic work, which those meanings then inform their game effects as cards. I'd like to introduce the basic game and its general rules so you have an idea of how it's played, but there are some complications and additional rules that I won't be able to get into in full detail here. The general goal for every player is to grow the greatest forest in the land. They accomplish this by placing or planting plant cards. All the cards are different types of plants. A player may have one or more groves, groupings of cards, and all those groves together form their forest. Their final score is the total value of all the cards planted in all the groves they control. The player at the end of the game with the highest score is the winner. The game is played with a deck of 120 cards, each card corresponding to a particular plant and showing a photograph as an example of that plant. Those photographs were taken by myself, my wife Alicia, or one of a number of helpful contributors, always taken live from a plant on site. The cards have values from 1 to 3, so there are 40 different plant types, each one with 3 cards, and those values correspond to the value of that card when planted for scoring, as well as, in the case of Ogham cards, the strength of its effect when played as Ogham. Cards can be one of 3 types. The most common type, with a green border, are trees. Trees can be planted individually. They're just placed in a grove, face up and upright, and add their score to that grove. Cards with a blue border with a twining ivy vine are climbers. Climbers in the game require a tree for support and can only be planted with and joined to a tree for support. A given tree can only have one climber, so you'll need a tree already in place, unoccupied, before you can play a climber. Finally, the third type, with a gold border, is undergrowth. Undergrowth grows beneath trees on the forest floor and generally takes up a lot of space. So for game purposes, you can only plant one undergrowth in a given grove. Now remember, due to certain rules, players may have more than one grove. So there's a possibility of planting more than one undergrowth, one for each grove. But generally this is a restriction on when you can play undergrowth. 25 of the 40 plant types in the deck correspond to the 25 views or symbols of Ogham. These Ogham cards are noted by the symbol at the bottom and the Ogham name in Old Irish. They also have the rules for how to play the card. A player has to choose a card in their hand for an Ogham card if they want to plant it as a plant, which is always an option, or play it or invoke it for its Ogham effect. Now these effects can range from such simple things as drawing additional cards, forcing another player to discard cards, or taking an extra turn, to such complicated effects as stealing plants from another player's groves, which is called transplanting, or ending another player's turn early or skipping them entirely. The strength of an Ogham effect is determined by the value of its card. So a 3 will have a stronger or longer lasting effect than a 1. So deciding when and whether to use an Ogham effect as opposed to planting a card is a key part of the game's strategy. And deciding when to use the right effect at the right time, in sometimes the right combination, is also important. Note that after they're used as Ogham, those cards are discarded to a discard pile rather than being placed or planted. With a few exceptions, certain Ogham cards will say that they can be placed for a different effect or planted after their effect happens. Let's go over how the game is played, step by step. First, shuffle the deck, get the cards random. Do that 2 or 3 times. Then place the deck on the table face down to create the draw deck. Then a dealer deals out 5 cards to each player. Now, this hand size will go up and down during play, and there is no limit on hand size. So if you're able to draw up to 8, 10, even 12 cards, that's great. More often, you may have to discard down to 3, 2, or even no cards, depending on what other players do to you. Now, play starts with one player, however is mutually agreed to choose. Roll dice, draw lots. With that player, then play proceeds in turns around the table, clockwise to the left. During each player's turn, they have a play phase and a draw phase. So a player first has to choose what card they're going to play and how. If they choose to plant a card, they place it in a grove in front of them, or players may choose to plant cards in other players' groves. Now, in a single-player game, this may not be helpful, except in very certain cases, but the option is always there. There is a team-based variant of growing the grove, in which planting trees and other plants in your allies, your teammates' groves, is actually very helpful. I'll talk about that more later on. Instead of planting, of course, a player may choose to invoke a card as Ogham. In that case, they reveal the card, describe its effect, and indicate what targets or effects it's going to have. So if it targets other players, they indicate which players. If it targets particular cards or plants on the table, they indicate those as well. A given Ogham card's effect may cause one or more actions. So when the player acts, they resolve each of those in turn. Then once all the actions are resolved for a given Ogham card, it gets discarded to the discard pile. Now this order of discard can be very important. Say an Ogham card causes other cards to be discarded, they go on the discard pile first, and the card only goes once its effect has been resolved. This is because one of the Ogham cards, Nyetal, actually draws cards from the discard pile from the top. So you have to keep track of that sometimes. A player may also choose to pass, that is, neither playing a card or neither planting nor invoking an Ogham card, but just passing their play. That's fine too. Once that's been decided, plant, invoke, or pass, then the player draws a card from the draw deck. Notice this is the reverse of many games, and that's done specifically because some Ogham effects will let you draw additional cards, but you always get that final draw at the end of your turn. Once a player has completed their draw, play passes on to the next player to their left. Now, note I'd mentioned that you plant cards in a grove. At the beginning, and possibly later on, a player may have no cards and no groves planted. In that case, the first tree or undergrowth that you plant begins your first grove, and your only grove. Now, there are certain card effects that let you start additional groves, and if that's happened, then you have a choice of which grove to plant a given card in. Now, play proceeds in this manner, turn by turn, until all the cards in the draw deck have been drawn and the draw deck is emptied. At this point, players may no longer draw cards on their draw phase. It's skipped entirely. They can continue, however, to play cards, planting or invoking. However, they can only pass if they have cards in hand that they can legally play. Play continues from that point until a player either has no cards left that they could play, or can no longer legally play a card. They need to announce that, and at that point, the game ends for the basic game. Notice that this is limited by the player with the fewest cards, for the most part. So having a big hand of many cards may not be that helpful toward the end of the game. And once the draw deck runs out, this kind of initiates a final phase to the game where players will more often want to plant as many cards as they can to get those final scores before time runs out. So it changes the strategy a little bit at that point. Once that happens, once the game is ended, you proceed to scoring. Scoring is just adding up the values of all the cards that have been planted in all the rows you control. Get that total, that's your score for the game. The player with the highest score wins. I should note for scoring that some Ogham cards are placed rather than planted in rows. These cards are not scored. Their value does not count toward your score total. They're only having their game effect, but they're not there as plants. Also, note that certain plants, because of their Ogham effects, like oak or dur, and gorse or on, do have different scoring rules depending on how they've been planted. So keep that in mind when tallying up your final score. There are a couple of alternate ways to decide when and how to end the game, and each of them changes the game's duration and strategies. The first option is called composting. That is, the first time that the draw deck is emptied out, instead of stopping soon after that, as soon as the last player has drawn the last card from the draw deck, take the discard pile, reshuffle it, and turn it back down, face down, to start a new draw deck. Now notice this is going to bring back into play all previous discarded cards, which are mostly going to be Ogham cards that have been invoked before. So this second round of play is going to introduce new strategies. Things get mixed up a little bit more as those cards come back into play. This will lengthen the game, and I do recommend only composting once per game if you choose that option. You could compost 2, 3, or even more times, but I find that that gives diminishing returns and lengthens the game unnecessarily. The other option, if you have limited time or want to keep the game to a shorter or finite length, is to play only to a certain number of rounds. Remember, a round is one turn for each player, generally unless they've been skipped or get extra turns. But you can set a fixed number of rounds, and then when that number of rounds have passed, keep track of how many have gone, you end the game there and score. This usually produces a shorter game than the standard. I recommend about 40 turns for 2 players, about 30 for 3, about 20 turns for 4 players, and 15 turns for 5 or 6 players. That'll keep a game to around the same length, and generally 30 to 40 minutes. You can set a higher number of rounds if you choose, and in which case then you have to decide, will the game end as usual once the draw deck is exhausted and a player can no longer play a card legally, or will you allow composting at that point and continue on into the fixed number of rounds? So it's a good idea before the game starts to agree among players, will there be composting, and are we playing till the draw deck is exhausted or a set number of rounds? Speaking of time, there's an entire section of the rules that I've had to leave out of this video, and that's the specific rules for the individual Ogham cards, the interactions of those rules, and some of the errata for questions that may come up when playing them. And let's face it, those rules and their interactions are a lot of the fun of the game. Unfortunately, it can get complicated, and even in the game guide, I'm not able to address every possible case, just the ones I've thought of that will likely come up. When a question arises that's not specifically explained there, I recommend reaching a group consensus based on fair play, fair judgment, and general agreement. before continuing. Of course, if you come across a problem or challenge that can't be addressed that way or seems like a regular problem, I absolutely welcome feedback. If you let me know here or at Luminathan Games, I'll be happy to address that and give my advice. I'd mentioned before that Growing the Grove can be played as a team game, which is fairly simple. You can play as 2 teams of 2, 2 teams of 3, or 3 teams of 2 each, always an equal number of players. Seat those players alternating around the table so that no 2 players on the same team are adjacent to one another and that members of the same team are equally distant from one another. Play then sets up and continues as normal, with the exception that at scoring, the score for a team is the total value of all cards planted in all groves controlled by all members of that team. So teams score together and win together. Obviously, this produces changes in play because now planting trees and other plants in your allies' groves doesn't cost you anything and may actually be a wiser play in some cases. Also, when you look at the rules, there are certain cards, certain Ogham effects that require you to make a deal with another player to get their agreement where both of you get a benefit. Those are much easier to get agreement on from a team member than with an opponent. The only drawback in team play is that certain cards with offensive or negative effects may be harder to use if you're trying not to target your teammates. In any case, when you get to the end, tally up the scores and the team with the highest total score wins. And that's the basic game of Growing the Grove. Hopefully you found this explanation clear and interesting. The game is simple enough to get started, but the complexity comes in when you consider the different effects and how they interact with one another. So we've tried it, play tested a number of times, and each time something slightly different emerges. However, if you'd like additional complexity, I also want to mention that there is an expansion set I'm offering, Cards of the Wild. This is an expansion set in addition to the base game of 12 more cards, each of which is not a plant card or an Ogham card, but a wild card. These wild cards cannot be planted, but only invoked for their game effect. And these wild effects are much stronger, bigger, and longer lasting than any of the Ogham effects. They do interact with them in interesting ways. For example, one type of wild card gets placed, not in a grove, but simply on the table, and adds points to your final score for every one of a particular type of plant that you have planted in any of your groves. Another type of wild card gets placed and lets you draw differently. For example, the well lets you draw from the discard pile. As I mentioned, these are entirely optional and can be added singly in any combination or all together to your deck for Growing the Grove. If you're interested, like I say, they can be purchased separately, but it is dependent on the base game, so it's just an additional expansion. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you listening. I hope you've enjoyed the game, and I hope that you'll consider purchasing it. But whatever you play, have a good game.